So, so we have three wonderful presenters and panelists, and I can tell you how excited I am about what the three of them bring together. So, I'll let them speak to that, but I can tell you a little bit why, we invited them, and it's because CMS as an interdisciplinary organization also really, apart from a study from the disciplines, it really learns from all the disciplines. And that's something that we really, as we engage a little bit in this, aspiration of decolonization, which is going to be the topic of the morning, like learning about that is very, from different disciplines is very important. So I met Harald, Atlanta, and Sandeep in different occasions and through different conversations. And they all bring things that for me really connect with the topics that, Kate is not here, because I don't remember the year we did a symposium on, disrupting colonial practices. This was probably 2018. And there were some questions and big picture issues that were coming from in that event that actually the sector was, trying to resolve. We're still trying to kind of resolve those, right? Especially when we try to develop some more specific action to them. And I think Harald's work bring a lot of those more like political and big picture issues. Atlanta, I met her maybe a couple of years ago, and I've heard her speak like maybe 2-3 times, and I'm like, oh my God, I have to bring her at some point, because I think what she presents and the models she's been working with, actually, I think it can really be adapted and help both CMS and organizations in the sector. And I also really like how, she talked about her research and her PhD as Indigenous resistance and researching. So that was very important. And Sandeep, I actually met him through a connection through CMS. But he also represents a lot, and you've seen probably in the program, his presentation is about an immigrant experience, which I think obviously is very fitting. But also he has very beautiful and funny stories, and I really enjoy how those stories actually translate into the work that he does and how he's actually kind of developed his thinking of the things that he does through those stories and those experiences. So, I'm very excited. So without further ado, I'm going to invite the first presentation. And I'll do a more official presentation now, which means just basically reading out of the program. Currently serving as a social policy analyst at the City of Vancouver, Atlanta-Marinna Grant is a UBC graduate in the Institute of Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. Her research and professional work has focused on what safe decolonized collaborative spaces between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people can look like. Please join me in welcoming Atlanta-Marinna Grant.
Thank you so much, Javier. It's a real honor and it's a privilege to be able to be here in front of you today and to share a little smidgen of what is just the collective knowledge that has been bestowed upon me. And now I have the kind of honor and privilege to bestow it upon you today. So that was a brief little introduction about me, but I also might just do a brief acknowledgement just about myself and the knowledge that will be shared within this presentation. So I want to acknowledge a little bit just about, obviously, Willie did a really beautiful welcome and introduction. But as the first speaker, I think I also just really want to root this work on the unceded lands of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. And also, though, where this research took place, which was in Kitasoo-Heihei's First Nation, which is one of the communities out in Canada's Great Bear Rainforest. This First Nation community is, you could think about it as opposite of Haida Gwaii. People are very familiar with Haida Gwaii. They are on the opposite side of that space. And so all of the knowledge that I'll share today and everything that I'll be discussing, while it does pertain to Indigenous knowledge, it's just really important to briefly just root that in the fact that it is collective. I am by no means an expert, and a lot of people might even break that down to what does that even mean right now to be an expert in certain fields. But there is a really beautiful Native American myth that is cited in Decolonizing Methodologies by Indigenous scholar Margaret Kovach, and I think it really roots it. So there's a Native American myth about a family of women who have tried to touch the sky year after year, century after century, and failed. Finally, one day, a young woman reaches up and succeeds. Father Sky is surprised and asks, "How did you get to be so tall?" The young woman replies, "I'm standing on a lot of shoulders." And so while this work that I'll share and the methods and all the modalities are informed by my research and my thesis, but also my lived experience as somebody with mixed ancestry, I have Métis, I have oral histories of Wendat and Ojibwe family members on my father's side. On my mother's side, I have German heritage. My lived experience will leach and kind of sift into this, but really it's the collective knowledge of the lands that we're on and the lands that all of this research took place. And I am merely a vessel to try to relay this today for everybody. So the overall theme today is, from my understanding, from what you all are going to be trying to go through, is what does decolonization require from you? And so while I'm not going to answer that question, what I am going to do is I'm maybe going to bring an approach shared through the lens of my experience within this work. And hopefully you can take some pieces away that can be attached to your own inner reconstruction, so your internal work, that can maybe then be brought out and latched onto the external work, how you communicate with others, how you lead your work, how you lead your space. And I say that is because it's really just important to recognize that while we're all kind of people sitting here, we can't do the work of decolonization if we aren't doing the decolonization of ourselves first. It really genuinely starts within the hearts of ourselves. And if we can't wrap our heads around that, it's just unfortunately not going to decolonize the structures that are around us. And so my experience of doing the work of decolonization in real time is latched through the lens of doing cross-cultural work with First Nation communities. So within my research and within the consulting practice I had before I started working for the city, I would get hired onto research projects that were in relation with First Nation communities. And so in relation with this work, I would be applying the framework that I'm going to share with you today. And this framework came to be in my thesis in Kitasoo-Heihei's First Nation. When we realized and were breaking down the methods for how we wanted to talk to one another, we realized that because my thesis was attached to a settler colonial institution like UBC, it was always going to inherently spread kind of colonial mindsets and tactics onto it. Didn't matter if I was mixed and they're Indigenous and we're trying to decolonize. We had to recognize where it was kind of springboarded to. So we thought, what a better act of resistance and resurgence than to come up with our own decolonizing framework that is situated within the uniqueness of who we are and who they are in this present day. And so I'll share these experiences and hopefully we can do the kind of work of seeing how we can maybe apply them to ourselves and others. But a small caveat, and that we can't pan-indigenize or like pan-culturize, if that's even a word. We have to be adapting and acknowledging the fluidity of all the cultural work that we're a part of, acknowledging that our lived experiences are so inherently attached and that nothing we do is neutral. And so it's really important. While these things might resonate with people, it's also vital to be adapting and maybe putting them in your back pocket and coming up with our own means of kind of decolonizing ourselves and others before us. And so to jump into that, this work, as I mentioned, was in Kitasoo-Heihei's First Nation, kind of on the springboard of, I went into it with decolonizing methodological baseboard. I really wanted to study Indigenous food sovereignty. I was welcomed out there through friendly connections, and we were going to chat about food survivance, which is a decolonized reframing away from food security, which is a method I'll discuss in a second. But when I was out there, I realized this actually isn't what they would like to speak about. So we're going to scrap the entire thesis, the entire ethics, everything. We're going to start from scratch. What do you want to talk about? We'll figure it out from there. From there, it was they wanted to talk about how government and non-for-profits come into their nation with this metric of doing good intentioned work, but it never was really rooting itself in a good intentioned outcome. And we thought that's probably because these organizations are reading books on decolonization or thinking about what they think it means, but they're not doing the work themselves to make sure that it's kind of coming out in that external, like we spoke about. And so we decided to build our own. And so while this was built on their knowledge, as I discussed, a little bit of myself, it's also built on the shoulders of a lot of Indigenous scholars that have been doing this work for a very long time. And two I want to mention are Margaret Kovach and Linda Twally Smith. Those are amazing books, and a lot of these metrics are taken from them. But so what does it look like, basically? A decolonizing cross-cultural framework looks like the hierarchy of expert gets shifted to parallel mutuality. It means crisis labeling, or also talked about as damage-centered research, becomes reframing. And so what does this all look like? It might mean that in the context of my experience, maybe an expert gets welcomed into a First Nation community. You're allowed to be an expert to a certain degree. You're allowed to have a knowledge of something. But we also have to recognize that we are sitting here attached to settler colonial institutions or attached to Western modes of thinking. So we have to be willing to kind of detach ourselves from it. It means asking questions like, where's your ego involved in the work? We all have one. It's always going to be attached to it. That's okay. If we can't recognize it or name it, it might actually create a hierarchy of expert, in which subconsciously you might not even be trying to do it, but the ways in which you're treating the people that you're working with from various cultures are perhaps diminishing the lived experience and the knowledge that they've had since time immemorial, for example. So when we decolonized that, it became what we called parallel mutuality. Parallel mutuality is kind of building on the two-war wampum methodological framework, which has been around for decades and centuries, since time immemorial. It's basically the concept that two opposing sides can come together to mutually agree, but they don't need to cross those sides. So what that means is we can actually walk alongside one another hand in hand. We don't always need to be trying to learn everything about the other. We don't need to be doing a cultural immersion like Indigenous scholar Kyle White talks about. You don't need to know everything about the Indigenous culture, for example, that you're working with. You just need to know what they want to share with you. You don't need to fully adopt that hat, and vice versa. You don't need to interweave yourself into their governance systems or expect for them to weave into the institution that you're working into. You just need to be able to hold hands, walk alongside one another, because then that also creates room for a disagreement to occur in a beautiful, healthy, rooted way, and not in a way where there's going to create an imbalance. And I talk about that, and I'll bring it up in a quick moment, but there's a reason for this, and I'll speak about it in a second. But Indigenous scholar Kyle White talks about that as avoiding the supplemental value to Indigenous knowledge. By parallel mutuality, it means that we acknowledge all knowledges are valuable within their own right. And then we avoid that kind of clash. That colonial hierarchy actually becomes this beautiful kind of parallel stream of collaboration. So another way we can do this is people tend to label kind of cultural-centric research or Indigenous-centered research in a damaging and vulnerable way. So we see this through the words we use. Food insecurity becomes reframed to food survivance. That actually acknowledges the colonial structures that we're working within. There's a really beautiful podcast called Don't Call Me Resilient. And I love that. And in this podcast, they talk about that. Why are we using the word resilient constantly to talk about Indigenous communities? You are making me resilient. Calling me resilient doesn't recognize the colonial system that's making me to force feed a kind of resilience behavior. And now again, there's so many contingencies that I don't have the time to get into. But there are Indigenous communities that like that word and they want to use it. Great, use it. It empowers you. It's fantastic. But are we asking these questions? Are we introducing a reframe? Are we allowing a parallel space of conversation to occur to even knock these down? What it also looks like is that if we activate these steps, so we're activating parallel mutuality, this coming alongside one another, mutual respect, all intrinsic knowledges are valuable within their own right. Everyone's an expert to a degree. We acknowledge that there's disagreements that are allowed. What this means then is by partnering that with other methods like the one I'm offering up today, such as a language reframe, it actually then means that the research or the project or whatever the outcome is that we were hoping for out of this project or this collaboration, it will just inherently enact Indigenism, sovereignty, and the reinstatement of Indigenous law. In sum, it basically means that by acknowledging decolonial methodologies as an intrinsic part of the work that we're doing, it means that the work isn't just going to accomplish the means to end. It's not just going to do what we hoped it would do. It's also going to be resistance. It's also going to be resurgence. It's also going to be decolonizing the system that everything's attached under. Because by enacting a decolonized methodology, you are also subconsciously, inherently enacting indigenism and sovereignty. Because indigenous sovereignty means autonomy. Reframing means choosing what language you want to use. By activating parallel mutuality, we're reinstating indigenous laws. That's an indigenous governance model as one small example that can't be applied to everything. But so it really does mean that our outcomes change. They become decolonized and they move in vast, more meaningful spaces than they could have before. Other things it does is it supports inclusion, and then it also can assess where cultural partnerships need to occur and recognizes their own limits. But what I'll briefly get into as I kind of lead up into a close is what activating parallel mutuality does as well, is it avoids the kind of weaving integration models that we're seeing very popularly today. And what I might pose as a wicked question is, are these weaving models, these braiding models, give me some of your knowledge, I'll give you some of mine, we're going to braid into one another. Are they perhaps subconsciously causing an indigenous knowledge erasure? Are they perhaps erasing culture by the nature of the fact that we're not acknowledging that it's one dominant system braiding into a less dominant system? Are we acknowledging that there's a dominant system braiding into a system that it oppresses? So there's these questions we need to ask when we're braiding under settler colonial institutions. As we're weaving, are we asking ourselves, what are the unladen power dynamics that we're creating? And what are we actually saying? Is it really decolonization if it's a dominant power system braiding into one that it oppresses? Is that really shaking the system up? I'm not sure. But what we can do by acknowledging parallel mutuality is we can kind of counteract these methods. And instead of erasing a culture, we can actually build it up, utilize its sovereignty, acknowledge its governance. It also can look like avoiding the cherry picking of indigenous knowledge when we do these pieces. That means we take the knowledge that we want and we leave the knowledges that we don't, versus the knowledge that they're offering up wholeheartedly, taking it, whether it matches our research questions or matches the heart or the goal intention that we wanted to accomplish. It avoids cherry picking. It avoids knowledge polarization. Quite often what I would see when I was doing this work more full-time, especially in the community I was working with, is they actually house almost like half of Canada's Atlantic salmon farm fisheries. And in more environmental movements, there's a lot of Indigenous people that are very anti-fish farming. However, there's a lot of Indigenous communities that have a lot to lose if fish farming was to go. This was back when that was all a big topic of conversation. So what happened was researchers come in, news outlets come in, and they actually created a knowledge polarization in the community that they were coming in to help. They created a divide by cherry picking what Indigenous knowledge suited their conversation, what Indigenous knowledge actually supported what they wanted to say, which meant that any other Indigenous people in that very small community, they disagreed with that. They became almost polarized from their own knowledge base. So we actually have so much power in these spaces to do these things, depending on what we take or what we choose, or if we braid and integrate and assimilate versus kind of come alongside together. But overall, and again, this is just a slide about language reframing, and it just kind of breaks it down. But it basically means that it's about taking much greater control over the ways in which Indigenous issues and social problems are discussed and handled. So reframing occurs in other contexts where Indigenous peoples resist being boxed and labeled according to categories which do not fit in. So with those examples I gave before, again, I was in a more food-centric background prior, but it looked like we didn't like food insecurity. Again, it kind of felt like resilient. It's actually not acknowledging the systems in place that are causing them to be food insecure. We preferred survivance. It was strong. It had autonomy kind of wrapped up into it. But overall, what do these frameworks kind of give you? Yeah, they give you some of that external. Maybe they can be sat within the pockets of your mind, and maybe you can start to unravel the ways in which, am I assimilating and braiding, or am I weaving? And again, a contingency is there's a lot of Indigenous scholars that love braiding and weaving. There's a lot of spaces that use it, and they do it quite well. All I'm here to do today is to pose something different, some wicked questions, so we actually can do that inner heart work to unravel if we're actually doing the work we want to do. Are we actually decolonizing? Or are we actually just perpetrating and causing a little bit of an Indigenous knowledge erasure in the example of my research by the ways in which we're not assessing this? So it is heart work at the end of the day. There's this very beautiful quote by Indigenous kind of eco-philosopher Gregory Kahete. And he says, and so I used his kind of discussion about the inclusion of heart. And I thought that this paragraph encapsulates what I'm trying to say in a beautiful way. So it's the exclusion of rational thought, and rather the inclusion of heart and being with rational perception to move beyond the surface understanding of a thing to a relationship which includes all aspects of oneself. It means that knowledge is a process, a way of entering into a relationship between ourselves and the natural world, rather than the means of acquiring everything about a thing or a being for extraction or self-centered change void of relation and heart, but rather the opposite. It's an inner change that can happen at the individual level through the inclusion of heart and destruction of ego. It really means that by doing these things, we can acknowledge the fact that we're not neutral beings, that all of our knowledge is, even this room right now, this knowledge exchange that we're partaking in, the speed networking later, none of it's neutral. It all attaches itself. It means that the language we use actually shapes the actions that we choose to form. And so I'm going to leave us with this quote that came from one of the elders in community that I have permission to share. And so when I asked this person, how do you feel, out of curiosity, about a lot of like Indigenous cross-cultural partnerships? And it feels as though people they know so much more about Indigenous knowledges than maybe 20 or 30 years ago. We've got all this paper, all this research. Like, how is it making you feel? Do you feel like it's still your knowledge if it's being taken and kind of pushed into colonial metrics or held under colonial institutions? And she said, our Indigenous knowledge is crucial to who we are. It's a part of our identity. Our lines are filled with our medicines. We must gatekeep our medicines, perhaps stop sharing so less arts are lost or misused. We need things that are just ours. Too many people with our knowledge who are not Indigenous overuse it all. There are parts of us that are no longer there. And that's what I want to conclude with, that kind of like lingering pause. If good intentioned research, if good intentioned collaborative practices, if good intentioned decolonial collaborative practices can still result in a community feeling as though their knowledge is being erased, then I think we need to do a bit more of a work at the inner level to assess the ways in which we're intrinsically a part of the work. What are we attaching ourselves to? Where's our ego involved? Are we forcing a braid? Is it happening naturally? Would a parallel method perhaps root itself better? Ultimately, how are we honoring the work that we want to accomplish? And these are just some questions that I always like kind of leave a community with, and I can share these slides. But for research projects, these are some of the questions I would ask them. Questions just about, who are you responsible to? What are your concerns? Where are you disagreeing with this community? Let's name it. Where's your ego involved? Where is it? And ultimately, it just means that we might start creating research spaces and collaborative practices that actually see, I believe, a future in which cross-cultural relations flourish. And we see more of a society in which cross-cultural knowledges are actually like amplified in beautiful ways that acknowledge the power structures we under. We can actually maybe start decolonizing the systems that we're in and ourselves as well as attachments of that system. So thank you so much. And my email's on this slide. That was a lot to go over in 15 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to message me at that email on the slide. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Atlanta. That was great. And I'm assuming that everybody's already started to like, oh, I have so many questions about this. So, we'll have time for that, probably not a lot, but, or not, the time that we could take for this. So that's also a great reminder, because if you have questions, if you have comments, if you have thoughts, the issues that are out there, they're very useful. And we do go through everything and we take a look to everything. And then it's a way, for those things. Also for people that might not feel comfortable standing up and sharing, or, sometimes like, oh, is this question good or not good? We hope that also in the spirit of what we're doing today, we can actually, remove those things from ourselves, because this is not about either or, it's not about right or wrong, it's about, especially, today, I think we were thinking about like how we create a space where, there's opportunity for a truth that is multiple, right? And then, so please do stand up when there's Q&A, go to there, find the panelists. So, it's a day for that. So you're all invited to participate in that way. Next one, Dr. Harald or Harald? Doesn't matter. Okay. Dr. Harald Bauder is a professor in the Department of Geography and the graduate program in Immigration and Settlement Studies at Toronto Metropolitan University. His research explores Indigenous newcomer relations, among other topics. He also leads the partnership project Urban Sanctuary, Migrant Solidarity and Hospitality in Global Perspective, which aims to co-develop and share knowledge on policies and practices for supporting vulnerable migrants and refugees in major cities across Africa, Europe, North America, and Latin America. Please join me in welcoming Harald Bauder.
My view, I'm afraid, is going to be a bit more pessimistic, and I'm hoping I'm not ruining your day. I want to backtrack a bit and zoom out and present an academic perspective that draws on my own research trajectory and how I connected migration with decolonization and indigenous kind of issues and matters. But I'm a scholar of migration studies. That's my field. That's where I'm grounded, and that's a perspective that I'm presenting. So I became interested in this connection between migration and decolonization more than a decade ago, years ago, when I conducted an empirical study on the connection between national imagination and migration policy. And strangely, I compared Canada with Germany at the time. And with national imagination, I'm referring to how we imagine our country's identity. So in Canada, in the context of migration studies, I always came across the idea that Canada is a country of immigrants. And that's the kind of national imagination that propels and connects to migration policy. But when we talk about immigration, in general, in migration studies and in public debate, we usually do not mention the impact it has had on Indigenous people. And I found this perplexing because in a settler society like Canada, the immigration of European settlers historically connects very closely with Indigenous displacement, with Indigenous land theft, and with genocide, cultural and physical as well. In addition, there has been an ideological justification for land theft and genocide by European settlers. Historically, land was construed as empty. Indigenous land was construed as empty, so it was available to be taken away from them. Indigenous forms of governance have been dismissed as primitive and not legitimate. And Indigenous peoples were denied their sovereignty. So there has been this factual relationship between immigration, especially European immigration, and Indigenous displacement and dispossession. However, today, when we debate migration, we deny that this connection even exists. And in my research, I suggest that this denial has something to do with our national imagination of Canada as a country of immigrants and a multicultural paradise. According to this national imagination, it doesn't matter where or to whom you were born. As an immigrant, you can come to Canada, you can make Canada your home, and you become a Canadian. All is well. That's how we define ourselves as an immigrant country. That Indigenous people were here first, and that they belong because of their ancestry and connection to the land, that doesn't fit this narrative. That doesn't fit the Canadian national imagination. And rather than acknowledging and kind of wrestling with this contradiction, it's much easier to ignore it. And I think that's why we separate the political debates about immigration from that of reconciliation. And we talk about immigration in that corner of the policy room, and when we talk about reconciliation, we kind of tuck it away in a different kind of corner of the room. But we don't bring them together. So in my research, then I asked the next question: How do we bridge this gap? Is there a way to bring these kind of narratives and discussions together? And then, of course, there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It published in 2015 its call to action with 94 recommendations. And then at the very end, the very last two recommendations actually deal with newcomers to Canada. Recommendation 93 asks the federal government to revise the study guide and citizenship test to include information on Indigenous history and treaties. And then the very last recommendation, recommendation 94, asks to replace the oath of citizenship to acknowledge Canada's treaties with Indigenous people. And I don't think that these two small measures are enough to address the ongoing kind of colonialism ingrained in Canada's immigration system. In a way, it actually affirms the Canadian state it suggests, okay, the study guide to acquire citizenship, and then also the oath to citizenship. It's a reaffirmation of the Canadian state, and we just kind of tweak it and everything should be well. I don't think that's enough. And let me just present my own experience as a settler immigrant in Canada and how it reflects this ongoing colonialism. I left my native Germany in the early 1990s, and then at that time received a visa to become an international student here in Canada because the Canadian state thought I would be a worthy student to come to Canada. And then as a doctoral student, I had enough education, getting my PhD, to immigrate under Canada's point system. And then in 2003, I met the residency requirements and some other sort of minor requirements to become a Canadian citizen. And throughout this entire migration process, the terms of entry, so immigration and then settlement and acquiring citizenship, were those of the Canadian state. Had I come to this land on the invitation of Indigenous people, I suspect the conditions of entry and the conditions of naturalization would have been very different. I imagine I would have not been required to speak English or French, which are essentially colonial languages, and it would have not mattered that I was an advanced student in an educational system that was also responsible for residential schools. And I wonder if I would have needed to swear allegiance to Queen Elizabeth II at the time and her successors. Probably not. And then in the next research project, I asked, like, what are the Indigenous voices about immigration saying about immigration? Is there anything out there that we can look at, texts, documents, and so forth, to kind of get a sense of what these Indigenous perspectives of immigration are? So I did with a graduate student, another research project, and we looked at these documents. And of course, we found that there's not a single Indigenous voice. Okay, there are many different voices out there having opinions about. Actually, there's not that much, but the voices that we saw or could find, they had expressed a variety of different opinions and a diversity of opinions. But we also found that most Indigenous commentators were not rejecting immigration. And let me just read a few quotes from, just to illustrate the kind of perspectives that we were finding in the literature. So here's a quote from Tsawwassen First Nation chief Ken Bear, who said, "I'm all for people who want to come here and work hard and build themselves a life and have good family values." So it's very supportive of immigration. Another quote from 2012, Chief Robert Joseph wrote, "We welcome you here," and he's referring to immigrants. "We are neither frightened nor challenged by your diversity and resourcefulness. Every color, every race, every creed has a right to be here." And just a final quote by Doug Cuthart, who's also a media commentator. He's of the Little Pine First Nation, and he wrote about a decade ago, "It's kind of late to complain about immigration. There are 35 million people in Canada, and only 1 million of us are members of the original First Nations. In fact, I'm quite happy that more people of color and diversity are coming to this country. We need a country that reflects more of the world." So these kind of voices are very, very supportive. And I suspected there would be more critical voices, but in general, we found great support, solid support for immigration. But in this context, within this support, there are also other voices who, on the one hand, support immigration, but then they also criticize Canadian government policy and the Canadian immigration system, especially for exploiting temporary foreign workers. And then also the treatment of refugees. And one of the examples here was how the Canadian government treated the 492 Tamil refugees that arrived on the coast of BC in 2010. Some of you might remember that. And then there are also finally some Indigenous voices that challenge the very legitimacy of the Canadian colonial state and this state's control of migration. And here's a quote. On the map of Turtle Island, the Canadian-US border is an illegal settler colonial construct that violates Indigenous sovereignty, end of quote. So the idea is that this state, this colonial state, has really no business to control immigration. I think this latter kind of point and this quote points towards a larger problem related to Canadian state sovereignty and its relation to Indigenous ways of governance. The Canadian settler state follows what I would call a Westphalian kind of logic of sovereignty, according to which this kind of sovereignty, according to this particular logic, the colonial settler state occupies mutually exclusive territory. There's a Canadian territory, then there's a hard border, and then immediately after this border, there's the U.S., the United States of America. And you cannot have both. There's not an overlap. It's just mutually exclusive. And then in each of these territories, there can be only one sovereign, and that's a Canadian state. And then this sovereign has complete political authority over this territory. And then, of course, we did another study because I wanted to know what the difference is between this Westphalian kind of logic of sovereignty and Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous understandings of sovereignty. And this concept has been circulating in the media, in public debate, and academic discourse for quite some time. So we were interested in what's Westphalian sovereignty and what's Indigenous sovereignty. And we found it's actually quite different. We did a literature review and that highlighted these differences. So we found that Indigenous sovereignty recognizes the relationships and interdependencies between different actors, whereas this Westphalian sovereignty says there's one actor that is sovereign, and that's the Canadian state. And that has supremacy over all other actors. Whereas the Indigenous sovereignty recognizes there are multiple actors and they interconnect and they're working together. Indigenous sovereignty acknowledges the relationship between people and the land. And Indigenous sovereignty is not so much just a legal construct in the Western colonial legal system and structure, but rather a social and cultural way of defining community. And Indigenous sovereignty is not universal or uniform, like this Westphalian sovereignty that looks the same whether in different parts of the world. And it's really a very Eurocentric kind of idea that was imposed upon the rest of the world through colonialism. But Indigenous sovereignty is very contextualized. It's contextualized in a geographical context and in a deeply contextualized in a cultural context. So I think our current situation and our dilemma, in a way, connects to these competing logics of sovereignty and these competing logics of governance and these competing logics of imagining nation and community in very different ways and in very fundamentally different ways. And I think bringing these differences and bridging these gaps, that's not easy. And even though I found Atlanta's talk about these parallel net neutrality very inspiring, going together the path hand in hand, parallel without really being forced to connect. When I look at my own research, I'm not sure whether that's so easy to achieve. I mean, I think you agree it's not easy to achieve. I'm not sure whether it's even possible to achieve, given these different logics of the colonial Canadian state and then Indigenous ways of governance and connections to the land. So I'll leave it here. I look forward to our discussion in a few minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's very good to have a lot of people now in the room after a few years, and like kind of circling back to these issues. And another thing that I would like to say also is how we're talking about this not being either or, and so also trying to make a space for contradictions, right? That can coexist. I mean, this is part of the complexity of the things that we are talking about. So our last presentation is by Sandeep Agrawal. Dr. Sandeep Agrawal is a professor and associate dean at the Faculty of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies at the University of Alberta. Dr. Agrawal's research interests are diverse, spanning sustainable urban and rural planning migration, energy transitions, Indigenous issues, and human rights. Among several national and international grants he has received, the most recent one is a almost 100 million CFREF grant, in which he is the project lead from the University of Alberta. An accomplished author of over 100 articles, professional reports, and 3 books. Dr. Agrawal has significantly influenced planning practices, city bylaws, and legislation through a focus on human and Indigenous rights and equity. He has also received the Canadian Institute of Planners National Academic Award for his substantial contributions to planning, education, and research in Canada. And sorry, I was smiling a little bit because one of the things that have changed from last year is that I should use my glasses, but I'm resisting. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sandeep.
Okay, so Masi Hizo Zo Navade, this is in Clicho. So thank you for coming to this session, and thank you to the UBC Center for Migration Studies, and especially Antia and Javier for having me here. What I'm going to talk about is my own journey in working with Indigenous peoples and what I've learned. And you will see that hopefully my presentation is very different from Harald's and Atlanta's. But what it does, what it did, this session did, it made me put my thoughts together, which actually I hadn't done so in a systematic manner over the years. But so let me just start off. So this is me 34 years ago, came to Canada. So the guy, you know, the gray jacket, just about to leave India in 1990. So I came here in 1990, completed my master's, and then pursued a PhD in the United States before returning to Canada and becoming a faculty member and colleague of Harald at TMU in Toronto. I spent about 14 years in TMU and then moved to the University of Alberta, where I have been for about 11 years. So just to give you an idea of how my journey began in terms of my involvement with Indigenous peoples. And I would say it began with a lesson in humility. So I received a SURE grant to study human rights across Canada. This was back in 2015, focusing on these rights, how they play out in urban and rural municipalities across Canada. However, I soon realized my method was flawed. This was after getting $250,000. I had focused on, in my study, I had focused on 66 metropolitan areas across the country, which literally left out the entire northern region of Canada. So as you know, census metropolitan area requires certain population size, which does not exist in northern communities. So to address this gap, I visited the Northwest Territories. This is again back in 2015. And the idea was to gather some data from the Northwest Territories Human Rights Commission. So my assumption was that given the challenges faced by Indigenous peoples, human rights issues would be prevalent and well documented. But to my surprise, there were almost no reports of issues reaching the commission. When I inquired why, I was told that Indigenous people perceive the Human Rights Commission as a colonial institution and distrusted it to protect their rights. So in conversations with Indigenous leaders, they asked me about the common issues that I have found in southern provinces. And I mentioned housing and homelessness, especially to do with Indigenous people living in southern provinces. And they shared that housing and homelessness were indeed major issues across all northern communities, particularly in the Clicho region, which you see in the map here. So the brown area. just north of Yellowknife. So they invited me to explore the matter on behalf of the Tlicho government. Now, the Tlicho government is the First Nations government, which was established by a comprehensive agreement back in 2005, and second only to Nunavut. And they asked me to work with them to identify any potential solutions. I agreed, not fully knowing how I would approach the research and what I was getting into. But it turned out to be one of the best decisions of my career. I was paired with Celine Zhou, which is on the extreme right there, who, although we were initially cautious of each other, became my guide, cultural interpreter, and true partner in the research. Together, we visited fly-in, fly-out communities across the Northwest Territories and within the Tlicho region to gather data, engage with the community, and ultimately we presented our findings to Chiefs Council, the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories, CMHC, the other key stakeholders. Now here's the thing, we found that housing and homelessness in the Tlicho region and across the Northwest Territories had reached a critical state. In some areas, up to 10% of the residents experienced chronic homelessness. They were literally out on the street in minus 40, minus 50 degrees with no shelter whatsoever. One key factor we identified was the high cost of power, often double or triple the cost of renting a public housing. This realization led us to investigate energy transition, energy sovereignty, just transition in remote Indigenous communities. Now, as a result of all of our studies, the Tlicho government gained partial control over the housing portfolio from the GNWT, that is the Government of Northwest Territories, secured federal funding for repairs, and since then I have continued to advise on developing an infrastructure and housing department within the Tlicho government. We have also developed a decision support system for housing repairs and a model for temporarily housing homeless individuals. Most recently, we have been engaged in modeling to predict wildfires in the area. So Tlicho region and indeed the entire north is increasingly vulnerable to wildfires due to rising temperatures, which are 2 to 3 times higher than the global average. We were talking 1.5. What we have noticed, it's already higher than 3 degrees in Canada's north. And there's a decreasing soil moisture as well. So all of this is leading to wildfire. So as you may know, in 2023 was one of the worst years of wildfire in the territories, which resulted in evacuation of all people from all 4 Tlicho communities, and of course the entire Yellowknife, the capital of the territories. Tlicho has borne the worst of the climate change, and what you see here is the amount of fires that has happened in the last 37 years. Forests have nearly halved, as you can see in the changes in the color here, while shrublands and barren lands have doubled, and grasslands have increased nearly 10-folds. So you can see the amount of changes that are happening and how it is affecting their daily life, caribou herd and the entire nature around them. Now, we have done a lot of work with other Indigenous communities like Satu people, as well as other folks like Gwich'in. So our current project explores the concept of duty to consult and how it might apply to setting immigration targets. This raises complex questions, and this is part of the bridging divides. How does Indigenous self-determination intersect with immigration, which Harald sort of alluded to? How does this relate to Canada's official multiculturalism, which aims to support all of Canada's cultures and subcultures? Should federal and provincial governments consult Indigenous communities on immigration levels before new people settle on their lands? 90% of Canada is still under treaty lands. So ultimately, we are examining two key questions. What do Indigenous voices say about immigration and immigrants? And conversely, what do immigrants say about Indigenous people? Now, I am an empiricist who theorizes from practice. So when I got into all of this, I didn't have a method in mind. So I don't do armchair thinking. I sort of get into the field, get my hands wet, and then go from there. So reflecting now back on my approach, I would describe it in terms of two-eyed seeing approach and conversational approach, underpinned by an ethos of Mother Earth relationality. So two-eyed seeing and conversational methods bring together Indigenous and non-Indigenous perspectives as equally valuable, that I think Atlanta was talking about. Western research often separates knowledge from values, whereas Indigenous approaches consider a holistic connection between beliefs, values, morals, and spirituality. And these methods align with Indigenous methodologies, which place conversation and storytelling at the heart of data collection. So effective research conversations require listening, co-learning, and respecting Indigenous framework on their own terms. Mother Earth relationality is central to Indigenous land ethos. In contrast to the Western view of land as a commodity, Indigenous worldviews see the earth as living, relative to whom we are all connected. Indigenous people have long held a deep, respectful relationship with the planet Earth, seeing it as home and an interconnected family member deserving stewardship and gratitude rather than treating it as a commodity. Now, I have not mentioned anything about decolonization so far, so let me just briefly address that. So decolonization involves reclaiming Indigenous sovereignty, cultural practices, land rights, as well as dismantling lingering colonial structures, ideologies. It also means challenging the Western frameworks that have shaped much of modern knowledge, creating space for other perspectives, affirming Indigenous ways of thinking. So I believe the method that I chose, the two-eyed seeing and conversational methods, it created sort of an ethical space acting as a way to decolonize. This part that I'm going to talk about, which is about Indigenous collective rights, and hopefully it'll get to what Harald was talking about, because I do a lot of work on human rights and sort of human rights law. Indigenous rights are recognized in the Canadian Constitution as collective rights, granting Indigenous people greater autonomy and decision-making power over governance, social and economic development, education, health, land, and even taxation. Such collective rights are different from human rights, which are individual rights. They're also different from group rights, which we may have as ethnic minorities, which are often granted temporarily to protect any discrimination against ethnic minorities. Collective rights, on the other hand, are permanent rights and continue beyond the period of discrimination. They grant Indigenous people the right to self-govern over their historical territories and to determine their own future without interference from the Canadian state. So as you can understand, group rights, human rights, the individual rights, and collective rights, and where I sort of work with is collective rights. So in my experience working with Indigenous communities has shown me that the decolonization of fields like immigration studies require us researchers, especially immigrant researchers, to decolonize their own perspectives, because we do come with very colonized perspective. This means immersing, and this may be a little bit away from what Atlanta was talking about, immersing ourselves in Indigenous worldviews, understanding their distinct context, and working in partnership with Indigenous communities. So a few key lessons I would like to share These are again from my own journey. And build relationships. Strong research relationships require trust and genuine connection, which can only be built over time. So not just go there, ask questions, and get out of that place. Build trust. Trust is earned through consistent, respectful, and transparent engagement. Build community capacity. Effective research includes empowering community members to use the results and develop solutions. And this is just as a side, I'm doing a bit of a promotion for my son, who's 17 years old. Build toys from 3D printer waste. So it's eco-friendly, and they are for developmentally sort of challenged kids, and it could be adapted for them. And we have donated thousands and thousands of toys to the schools and early childhood centers in the Tlicho region because they don't get any other donations, as may happen here in Vancouver, Edmonton, and other places. Listen and consult. Researchers must prioritize listening and consultation over imposing external framework, and spend time in the community. Presence in the community builds understanding and credibility. Lastly, I would say in terms of lesson, choose relevant research questions relevant to the community. Question should address the actual needs and priorities of the community rather than of the researchers, which is what we did. We asked what their needs were, and we progressed just based on that. So in closing, this journey has transformed not only my research, but also my understanding of Canada and the people who inhabited this land long before settlers set their foot here. So working alongside Indigenous communities has deepened my appreciation for the richness of Indigenous knowledge, the urgency of addressing ongoing issues in these communities, and the necessity of respectful and collaborative research. Masicho.